Welcome back to Mutually Assured Conversation. I am back again with Thomas777. How is it going, Thomas?
Very well. Thanks for hosting me. It's a pleasure and an honor, as always.
Very much appreciated. I'm just going to launch straight in now because this is someone who we alluded to in our previous conversation was Schopenhauer. I'm in the middle of doing a very close reading of his work. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity for us to talk about it in a bit more depth, basically. I'm going to leave this really open-ended to start with because I'm very interested to get your perspective without me tainting it with my own thoughts. So I'm just gonna put it out there. Whether you want to answer it from a philosophical, historical context, whatever. What do you make of Schopenhauer in general?
Schopenhauer was very heterodox. I mean, in all kinds of ways. Not. I mean, on the one hand, he's very obviously in the German idealist tradition, but the way his kind of the way he posits man, especially as a cultural organism or actor, like his ontology is very unique. And I don't want to digress the conversation, in a historical discussion of 20th century personages, but I actually first came to Schopenhauer when I learned that Adolf Hitler, became very, very intrigued by Schopenhauer, during his Vienna years, and then he carried the world as will and representation apparently on the Western Front. Like that was kind of like his go-to philosophical text. And there's a kind of punitive claim about Hitler that he was this kind of anti-intellectual figure. Like, that's not true at all, but Hitler was not particularly philosophically inclined. So it is relevant that Schopenhauer was kind of the modern, continental theorist that he considered to be most most important, at least not just to his own ambitions, but to what he viewed as the historical mission of the German people. I believe in part that has to do with the kind of dehumanizing effects of the second industrial age and the kind of militarism that partook of those technological innovations. Schopenhauer is fundamentally concerned with the self, not in terms of what is it to be an individual or something like that, but the kind of eradication of the self, that really comes through in his kind of discussions, both oblique and direct, about Buddhism. Like he this kind of idea of the individual man, kind of losing his capacity to structure a discrete kind of identitarian personality anymore, just because the kind of the kind of conceptual pole stars to draw upon aren't there any longer. Schopenhauer doesn't suggest that that's some horrible thing. In some ways it's a profoundly liberating tendency, and it kind of facilitates Western man's exit from this kind of Faustian anxiety of finding himself situated literally against time, both in his own life and in terms of in terms of the the short the short time of that his culture has, that any cultures truly have. obviously too, somebody like Hitler, what Schopenhauer posited was one of the, with kind of like the primary reprieve from any tendency towards despair within this milieu is art and aesthetical things, and like literally the creation of culture. This is what Nietzsche was called, later would call value creation, but it's not, kind of in the same vein, but it's distinguishable, so I think, to me, and again too, like I'm not trying to insinuate my own kind of discrete conceptual prejudices and my own kind of, research interest into the conversation, but I think, Schopenhauer is more important to how European man came to view himself in the modern age, particularly the late modern age, than people tend to credit him. I've noticed in the Anglosphere, in America as well as in the UK. I mean, like probably less so in the UK, but it's still very much present, because I mean I've read plenty of UK scholarship on Schopenhauer. There tends to be like there's a general prejudice towards continental philosophy. Okay, the exception is Leibniz and Spinoza, but even that it's not is not treated with the same esteem as other things. But the I think if one was to pick, I mean, other than Hegel, obviously, who is like if we're talking about if we're talking about modern continental philosophy, I mean that really truly does begin with Hegel. I mean, I realize there's people like Fichte and others who contributed to the um kind of Hegelian, what we accept as like the Hegelian paradigm of historical processes and everything that goes into that. But if there's one single thinker who contributed kind of the most to European man's idea of self as a culture bearing organism, and kind of from which European man developed a sort of historical and political ontology of what his historical mission was. I would say that thinker is Schopenhauer, and I think a lot of people on the right don't understand that entirely, and they tend to invoke Nietzsche because that's I think Nietzschean kind of thought in a dumbed down kind of abrogated way is like so ubiquitous that just tends to be people's kind of go-to reference points. But the all the phenomena that Nietzsche identified as kind of the long crisis of Western man. I mean, these things were very much articulated by Schopenhauer. Okay, in a more subtle way, in a more developed way, and in a less in kind of a less, like, dare I say, like, lurid way in terms of overwrought language and things. But that's basically, I'm not a Schopenhauer expert at all, but I do know something about continental philosophy, and I do know something about modern political theory, particularly modern, continental political theory. So, though that's how I came to Schopenhauer, that's what I think is most important, particularly to somebody whose primary interest is historiographical and revisionist in nature, or people who, particularly kind of students of the 20th century, who want to understand, kind of what, uh, what the men directly insinuated into these epochal events we're drawing upon intellectually to to kind of structure the world around them in philosophical terms, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I think there's an unfortunate cliche that caught on when looking at Schopenhauer in the Anglosphere, which is that you hear a lot in academic circles that Schopenhauer took German idealism and turned it on its head, and I think that's just like such a for some reason it appears in so many different like books and studies of him, but I think it's kind of a misnomer. It doesn't really describe what he's actually addressing. I think Schopenhauer, this is the way I put it simply, is he's taking the thing in itself proposed in Kantian philosophy, and he's buttressing it by the experiential factor of our lived experience of this will that he talks about, making that will itself the only thing in itself we can know, therefore making there's a thing in itself that I experience and through my will, and there's a thing in itself that you experience through your will. And I think it's connected to the dehumanization of the 20th century and the death of God, because will is a basic unit of all things, and it's in all things, and in that sense, I believe it is in maybe a covert way, it's coming in to replace the place of God. I think the mention of Nietzsche made is very apparent, because Nietzsche was by all ways of describing he was a student of Schopenhauer, and I think you said Nietzsche puts it in fairly lurid terms, and I think that's correct, because his only real response to Schopenhauer is by parodying him in Zarathustra, for example. One thing you did mention is the sort of the disgust in the Anglosphere. I think there's another way of saying it: the disgust in the Anglosphere of continental philosophy, and I think that's probably because the Anglosphere tends to come from a philosophically analytic perspective. What do you think that's a result of?
I think part of it is, I mean, there's a lot of things going on here. Okay, I think he takes it too far. But E. Michael Jones, when he makes the point that Isaac Newton was in very much kind of in almost like a puerile way trying to rebut Aristotelianism, obviously as through the lens of Aquinas, and he also was kind of like attacking the pre-Socratics and in their assumptions and things, to try and create kind of like a new, like, kind of pure science. Part of that was there really was a tendency of the kind of anti-Romanism of the English of the English Enlightenment and Scottish Enlightenment, like, really can't be overstated. Okay, so there's that, but it's also the when you read people like Bentham, and I encourage people to, because he was a far more impactful theorist than people credit. Like, where the rubber meets the road in terms of how policy developed. I think in some ways he was a lot more impactful than somebody like John Locke. Okay,
Yeah,
but this kind of idea of we can sort of like extricate, we can kind of extricate the passions from any sociological or political endeavor at scale. We can somehow completely manipulate historical outcomes. I think that's a big part of that's a big part of it. And why scientism came to be so prominent in Anglophone cultures. I mean, like I said, I think there's a highly political dimension to that, because when you do one thing that the Catholics were right about is that it's one thing to reject, and I mean, I'm a Presbyterian, I'm a Calvinist Presbyterian. Okay, like, so I'm not sitting here like dropping like Catholic apologia on you on grounds of some cultural bias of mine own or something. But I think some of it was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think some of it was just that, I mean, the immediate kind of exigencies that emerged. I mean, if we can start in political terms, you know, when does the Enlightenment start with Hobbes? You know, I mean, these it appears if European modalities, continental modalities, um, continental ways of configuring the state were just failing. You know, it's really interesting to compare to kind of the inner warriors in the 20th century, because it just appeared as if, you know, we've got to, you know, we've got to throw out these you know, any kind of vestige of the ancient regime, you know, because these things just can no longer facilitate the outcomes that we need them to. Okay, so and I look at the War of Three Kingdoms as being as catastrophic in Britain as you know, the 30 Years' War was on the continent. There's weird parallels there too. So, and I think this kind of idea of, like, you know, stripping everything down, you know, to that which is empirically knowable, you know, and that which can be availed, you know, to a methodological paradigm, that's basically unimpeachable according to its own postulates. And I mean, yeah, I realize that's a tautology, but I think that's part of it. But it's also, there's something and I don't trash the English or the Scots. I mean, that's where like a good portion of my own, you know, racial heritage is derives. I mean, but this kind of when Spangler says that you know, England kind of like you know, kind of like the Dutch, you know, they became a mercantile race almost, you know, not in a pure sense, because obviously they've got this great martial tradition, but that doesn't allow for cultural activity, high cultural activity of the sort that we really think of it. You know, so when I think it was something of a perfect storm of stuff, and you know, it's just also I think there's something in the center Christianity that is hostile to metaphysics,
Yeah.
outside of you know, the very outside of the process by which one comes to know God. Okay, but even that, you know, that very much is related to piety and the inner witness in most traditions.
Yeah.
It's not related, you know, that it's not related to extrinsic things, and it's not related to you know, a series of ritualized steps that are said to take place, you know, in sacred time, you know, owing to their edifying properties. So I mean, it's all of those things, in my opinion. But I'm not a theologian, and I'm not, you know, any kind of expert on this. It's a very heady topic, but that's it, my opinion, and I think I have something to say on this. That's what it is.
Yeah, there's a possibility. I mean, myself being an Anglo, that, you know, viewing the importance of my own nation more than it actually is important. But I think you're correct, because and as I've been more interested in the ethnos of nations, I've come to realize that I think the Anglos and the dissenter ethnos of the Scots and things like that are, you know, ultimately a merchant people. They view view the world in like, I guess in some ways like economic terms, but in most ways like you said, Benthamite terms. They're viewed in utilitarian terms. I think that's the like the ethnos of those people. And for whatever reason, right, there was conflicting views of the world in North America. But for whatever reason, I believe the Anglo merchant view is still, it was made supreme and is still supreme there. I think you're right. I think that philosophers tend to, especially continental philosophers, tend to just dismiss things like utilitarianism as it doesn't even fit into their conceptual framework. But I think the threat of utilitarianism and, in all honesty, the convenience and power of utilitarianism as a worldview is incredibly powerful. And I think you can see its influence all the way from, like you said, the assumption in the early 20th century that we're going to be able to predict economic historical outcomes, and this has its has its fruits in the attempts at planned economies. Whether or not you have the information to conduct a planned economy, there is the assumption that these gaps will be filled and we'll be able to fulfill this. So that's all things in Sovietism. But you also see a weird offshoot of that as well in modern neoliberalism, which is demonstrated in the modern state, particularly in the UK. Where we have these policies of nudge politics, where it's all about behaviorism and getting people to generally adhere to certain things. I mean, anyone who's lived through the last 3 or so years, I think that's laid pretty bare. But I think one of the great the faults of utilitarianism, despite all of that, is it assumes, I think you alluded to this, it assumes that you're going to escape metaphysics. It assumes that it is objective and is looking without a metaphysical outlook. But ultimately, whatever thing you are deontologically attaching utilitarian value to becomes your metaphysics. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that's kind of what I
No, definitely. And that's what I cite Wolfgang Smith a lot. He's outside of there's history of science people like academics, and there's there's guys who who pursue like philosophy PhDs these days, but that's kind of that's kind of dying out. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, I guess it's two-sided. I mean, it's not a bad thing that traditional academia is dying out, because it has to, and it's incredibly corrupt. But in any event, Wolfgang Smith is, I believe, he's the most important living, like philosophical writer. Okay. And Wolfgang Smith, he makes the point that you did, that one of the the abolition of metaphysics is that's in large part like the raison d'etre of of the Enlightenment enterprise. Okay. But the problem is that the enlighten the progeny of the Enlightenment, all and sundry, they're presenting natural law postulates. Okay. And that creates like fatal contradictions. Like, not to sound like some like Marxist or something, but you can't abolish metaphysics while at the same time attempting to attempting to cultivate an elevated moral schema. Because like, then what are you relying upon? It's like, well, you're basically relying upon like utilitarian sociology, or you're making some kind of claim about law and order at scale in kind of just crude policy terms. But you're really kind of hollowing out the true foundation of any philosophical system. And it's also because nature abhors a vacuum. You're things that are really kind of at best kind of banal, and at worst rather insidious, they're going to take on theological characteristics. Not even in conspiratorial terms, because the men at the helm of these things are going to cultivate that. But I mean, they will in some instances, but that's just kind of the way human minds structure the world, particularly at scale. Okay. So people are going to view Whether it's in America, people kind of viewing like, the federal judiciary as some kind of like rabbinic council of like wise men or something that, is dealing not just in kind of the prosaic business of managing controversies at law, like that becomes kind of in the public mind, something godly, okay, like lowercase g, or people come to view like executive acts of government, how subconsciously or not, it's quite literally like a miraculous event, like an intervention by a sovereign authority, not constrained, by the, kind of temporal or juristic boundaries of any kind of ordinary actor, within the sovereign dominion. People place like an undue significance on like what that agent does, because it's outside of what remains of, moral constraints, or at least what like passes for moral constraints. So that, and I don't want to, I guess it's a bit outside the scope of our discussion, but that's kind of like the elephant in the room that these people like John Rawls and these kinds of and these and Karl Popper, and these kinds of like very postmodern like moralists, that's kind of like the white elephant in the room that they can't account for, like, because again, like what they're doing is they're jumping through all these hoops, to avoid any metaphysical postulate or any kind of anything that appears superficially or actually, to be a natural law claim, to arrive at, kind of the outcomes they want. But then like it raises questions of agency, and it's like, well, what's the inherent like what's the inherent moral authority of like these agents, and they can't say that. It's just,
Yeah.
so then they just kind of like, again, it becomes a tautology, like, oh well, this is essential because otherwise, there'll be institutional racism, whatever that means, or this is just necessary because the alternative is that people go to war, and we've moved beyond that now because we've created complex interdependence between nations, and we're doing everything we have to abolish these like irrational identitarian attachments people have that gave rise to war, which is always irrational. And interestingly, as I'm always saying, and forgive the tangent, what is the one contribution of the Germans to the Enlightenment rationalist paradigm? It's Clausewitz. It's the study of warfare, which is very telling in itself. But yeah, forgive me if that was kind of scattershot.
I think what you're saying about particularly people like Rawls and Popper, who I unfortunately had to read as part of my philosophical studies.
Everybody does, I think. Like, yeah, 30 years ago, like when I was in college, stuff they did, and I think that's just like perennial. Like everybody does, which sucks. It's an ordeal, but yeah.
Yeah. But what you're saying is very true. In their attempt to be non-metaphysical, they become hyper-moral in the sense that they just end up propping up anything that, whatever you want to call it, the system does, basically. And what is very interesting, I guess I just kind of like get your general thoughts on this, because I've been thinking about, you've mentioned a little bit there, the idea of particularism. I've been thinking a little bit about particularism recently. It kind of ties into what I was trying to say about ethnos before, basically. But I do feel that whatever this system is that we're talking about, whatever this thing is that we are faced with in the modern Western context, it does seem to be a blind thrusting into some attempt at universalism, right? It is that sort of, at its base, it is that dream of all the races of the world coming together and singing Kumbaya together. And it's strange because I kind of view it in the same way I view any utopia. It's like, well, that would be great, but and you've said it yourself many times that politics is not some godly thing. It's not some thing that's is going to be heaven on earth, you know. So I suppose, what's your sort of? Do you have anything else to add to that?
Just that, I mean, there's a few things going on. I mean, like I said, even um Eric Veblen, or not Eric Veblen, God, I'm drawing a blank. Uh the Eric Vogelin. Eric Vogelin. I don't think anybody reads him anymore. He wrote a volume called Political Gnosticism. And students of Carl Schmitt um should I highly recommend it. Like Vogelin in some ways, I mean, he's very different than Schmitt, okay, but he Vogelin kind of made the point that I touched on a moment ago about how, just owing to the fact of nature proverbially abhorring a vacuum, like in the absence of metaphysics, and in the absence of you know of a robust theological tradition kind of at the foundation of the body politic and like the culture from which it originates. People are going to develop ideas about government that are not really healthy, individually or at scale. So that's part of it. But it's also the it's the problem itself. And to come back to Wolfgang Smith, he Smith talks about the problem of scientism, as he calls it, like the scientific method kind of coming to subsume all um all modalities of inquiry. That's kind of the only true methodological you know way. um the methodology does come to prejudice you know um conceptual horizons in total. Okay, so if you live in a managed society, I mean, like in the terms Burnham talked about, where, regardless of ideological configuration of government, there's there's an element, greater or lesser, depending on the size of the polity and depending on the level of technological development and all these other things. But to a greater or lesser degree, there's going to be managerial institutions, just because when you're dealing with that many, I mean, even if we're talking about a state that basically abides free market principles, or like what passes for such things anymore, or like neoliberal principles, like we're not talking about a planned economy, and we're not talking about, a state where, other than, manipulation of interest rates and things, and kind of the management of the money supply, it doesn't intervene really in economic activity. Like, even if you're talking about a relatively, kind of free enterprise friendly regime, people are going to come to look at people are going to kind of come to look at the logic of government as sort of the correct methodology to accomplish all things, like, so at, social, political, economic, um and that after a certain point, like, alternative methods become almost kind of unthinkable, and I think we're already at that point. And that's one of the reasons why I made the point before that I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, and it was really, really interesting to see the government flounder after November 9th, 1989. Then Bush, how everyone feels about Bush 41, he had a crack foreign policy cabinet. They very kind of seamlessly, and with kind of a heavy hand, kind of made this transition out of the Cold War, and were attempting to kind of, erect the architecture of, their New World Order model. And that totally, went to pieces, deliberately. It was kind of dismantled after Bush left office. But the basic structure of government remained, but it was obsolescent really by the time Bill Clinton took the oath of office. Like, yet it endures. I mean, part of that's because the iron law of bureaucracy, as I think Jerry Pournelle talked about it. Like no state apparatus voluntarily dismantles itself, no matter how obsolescent it is. But it was also, people just couldn't really conceptualize, government in any other way. They not just because they'd been, conditioned for decades, from the time they could speak, really, having sent to public school and stuff, but they'd come to lack like the intellectual and conceptual tools, to conceptualize, sociologically and politically, like how things could alternatively be ordered. Like, I think that's part of it. And that dovetails with what Wolfgang Smith said about, methodology coming to corrupt the process of inquiry. And his example is like just that, as you suggested, metaphysics is abolished because that which cannot be known or deciphered by the scientific method just ceases to exist. Because the methodology becomes, this kind of revelatory mechanism almost, and anything outside of that just can't even be said to exist because, it can't be quantified in the way that, is posited to be, the absolute method of quantifying anything that is real. So anything that can't be so identified, characterized, analyzed, and defined is just not real categorically. So yeah, I think you're right, 100%.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, what stands out to me as the problem with politics since the falling of the Berlin Wall is that we seem to be defined by a complete lack of imagination, to put it any other way. Like every single thing that we go through politically seems to fall within democratic realism. Like there's no like real imagination. Like, for example, to take the example of the British monarchy, like people could only see it within economic context. Oh, I think that's going to stick around for tourism and slowly decline and all this sort of stuff. And thinking about things like with the presidency of Donald Trump, like it's only going to be fit within this paradigm. What's going to happen? That all seems to be because it falls afoul of thinking that these things are going to be centrally managed by governments. And what we have ended up with is, to return to Burnham, we have ended up with a panopticon. I mean, I'd be interested to get your perspective on this as someone who's lived in two different worlds, because you do use some social media, for example, but the panopticon is not a big physical institution that is centrally managed. The panopticon is distributed amongst all of us. It's distributed amongst the technology we use, and that seems to be what has changed since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it seems to be going about it in its own way, despite the lack of central government actually having a handle on what it exactly is. And I suppose on that topic, the agent of government no longer seems to be centrally in a place. It seems to be outside of that, and maybe that is what we're seeing in what people are now calling AI. Now, I've got my opinions about whether that's actually AI and that sort of stuff, but I would like to get your opinion on that train of thought.
I mean, what the real strength of Burnham, okay, was the fact that he recognized that all truly modern states they're configured basically the same way. Okay, ideologically they have different priorities. Militarily there's different existential problems they have. Based on where they're situated geographically. I mean, like the internal situation is more robust or more frail, depending upon the constitution of the body politic and things. But beyond that, there's not radical differences in the ways people live their lives, like adjusting for culture and racial differences and everything else. Okay. The panopticon, it's I mean, what is really its raison d'etre is the Stasi, the Ministry for State Security in East Germany. It's kind of unofficial motto among the officer ranks, was to know everything. And that's really they came close to accomplishing that. I mean, granted, they were presiding over something of a rump state, but there really does need to be the ambition of any modern state. Now, how you go about that is going to depend on a lot of things. Not all of which are just kind of accidents of technological development. If you have a body politic that basically consents, to the sovereign legitimacy of the regime, they're going to do a lot of your work for you, okay? Because they're going to live their lives for the most part in public spaces, because there aren't really going to be private spaces anymore, and that's increasingly the case here. That's one of the reasons why, like, I'm always making the point about social capital and vanguardism, and they're not two different things. Like, they're inextricably tethered, but we actually are like building private spaces for our people, and that's essential, and I take some pride in that, in my own little role in it. But beyond that, the controlling people at scale, obviously the kind of quintessential counterfactual treatment of that is Orwell's 1984, which is a very insightful book, and most people kind of misconstrue what's actually important in that. But the kind of key takeaway is in the last third of the book. And as O'Brien starts to torture poor Winston Smith is like, look, like, I'll stop being a dissident. I'll do whatever you want. I'll inform on people. I don't care. And O'Brien's like, no. I don't want to. I don't want to break you into swearing allegiance to the police or something, and I don't want to force you to spy for us or something. He's like, I need you to love Big Brother, and I need to eradicate entirely your ability to conceptualize some kind of alternative to the status quo. Like, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what Stalinism was. Okay. Now that's a very, very extreme iteration of the process that we're talking about, but to a greater or lesser degree, or to, speaking metaphorically, a harder or softer degree, that's the raison d'etre of any modern regime, in terms of its internal police function and its sociological conditioning function. It's got to not just punish people for doing things like forming terrorist cells, or for organizing protests like on January 6th. I'm not suggesting those two things have anything in common, but what I'm talking about is, like, dissident sentiment to greater or lesser degrees. It's not its mission, the regime's mission can't just be to, you know, place people in fear if they transgress these you know, these prohibitions. You've got to really, you know, truly kind of abolish their ability to conceptualize something other than the status quo, you know. And once you do that, and concomitant with, you know, the kind of abolition of metaphysics from even, you know, the most learned man's, you know, kind of conceptual understanding of the world, you know, you're really just left with, you know, man as a subject of government. Okay, and you're really left with you know, and within that man's eyes, like individually or at scale, you know, you're left with a human being. And, you know, the way he views authority is as this kind of singular, pretty much immutable thing that's only possibly configured in one way. Okay, you know, it's and that's not science fiction. Okay, that's very much happened, you know. And the one of the ways America won the Cold War was by accomplishing that. Okay, and how America accomplished that um is a bit too large a topic for this discussion, and we can talk about that some other time if you want, a dedicated capacity. But one of the things that killed the Soviet Union, it wasn't just that the Soviet Union relied too much on the proverbial club in lieu of the stick, or in lieu of the carrot, but it's also these sort of features of reality that the Soviets were, or the, you know, East Berlin, or, you know, Ceausescu's security element, or, you know, wherever one was in the East Bloc, you know, these kinds of postulates that they were issuing forth about the nature of reality. These weren't things that, you know, people could relate to anymore, like subconsciously or not. You know, like this, the world had moved beyond revolutionary communism and no longer had a context, you know. um and that's important. One of the strengths, I'm speaking in value neutral terms, not moral ones, obviously. It's starting to fail in this regard, which is why the American um regime looks so bizarre. But America had a remarkable ability. It was remarkably malleable. Okay, it could very much kind of like change its skin, you know, and kind of alter its appearance and its kind of conceptual narratives, you know, in ways that kept up, didn't just keep up, or in some ways kind of one step ahead of the culture, but that at the end of the day really you know, maintained the kind of essential core um characteristics and essential features of the regime as it had always been. um you know, it was very, very, very good at that. And during the Cold War, I mean, that was essential. I mean, not just for, you know, conventional understandings of PR and things, but it's America began really losing its ability to do that. You know, during the Clinton administration, and since the Clinton administration, like government's just been very strange and like very out of touch and almost kind of late Soviet like. So, you know, I speculate that process, albeit in a less dramatic and punctuated way. Like there's not going to be a November 9th, 1989, you know, event in the next like 5 years or something. I mean, I think America is going to die from 1,000 cuts over the next 2 centuries, and then one day it just like won't really exist anymore. You know, it doesn't name. You know, but it is it but that is, you know, what um owes to its its incredible force potential, as well as its capability to sort of insinuate its own conceptual prejudices and things into other societies, some of which are quite alien, as it's done with Ukraine, which is a weird case. And I don't think a lot of states could do that anymore. Okay, but Ukraine's an example of what I'm talking about and what America traditionally is very, very good at. But yeah, that's I hope that wasn't too tangential.
No, I think it makes. I think a lot of people jump to analyzing the material conditions or distant activity when genuine control comes from making that sort of activity ontologically unthinkable. And this is why the conceptual battle, or some people might phrase as spiritual war, sort of needs to
Sure.
be won before action can be made. I did want to return while we can, just to, because you mentioned it already, that Schopenhauer's work is heavily influenced by Buddhism. And I mean, at least, a 19th century version of Buddhism. I'm kind of open to someone who knows the topic better than me to give their interpretation. But my kind of view on what Schopenhauer took from that, at least, is that, life is essentially endless, insatiable desire. Maybe you can reflect, as a Protestant, but I'm interested to hear what you think about that in general.
Yeah, and liberation from liberation from the passions, is is um is godliness. Okay,
Mm.
I realize Buddhists don't have the same view of the divine that you know a reformed prod does, like me, but that's a very compelling postulate, and that's why um around mid-century, I think, including Orwell, like there's a lot of it's mistranslated as death worship, the state of enlightenment or what have you, or the kind of reverence that is afforded the elevation to such states. It and again, that's a question of something being lost in translation, in some ways very grossly, but Buddhism does make a friend of death. Okay, and I modern European man, one of his grand challenges is making a friend of death. Okay, that doesn't mean people should set out to be morbid or something, or dwell on these things unduly, but I, in my own life, I have gone out of my way to make a friend of death, and the the ability to kind of let go of the discrete individual personality, and the kind of sheer and mortal terror that attends, in much of the Western world, the concept of letting go of the body and letting go of the individual discrete consciousness, that does not bode well for the psychic or spiritual, um cultural, racial health of a people over time. And Schopenhauer, despite you know not having any kind of having abandoned any kind of Christian sectarian or confessional heritage, long before he reached the peak of his creative output. Looking around, especially in his epoch, um, he would have seen not quite, as like degenerate as Weimar or something, but he would have seen a very kind of decadent embrace of the most sort of like bacchanal, like pagan impulses that obviously people were pursuing as a way of coping with this horrible despair that they were enduring day to day about the looming specter of death, and a lot of a lot of a lot of the late 19th and early 20th century, both in Europe and like across the pond in the United States, even a lot of these like transcendentalist authors who people view as being kind of like corny, like nature worshippers. This was this kind of thing. He was like, if one reads in a discerning way, even a lot of that stuff was kind of like shot through with these the kind of horror of the void awaiting every man at his death. The Ingmar Bergman film, The Seventh Seal, that's a really disturbing movie. It's a great movie, but it for those that don't recall the title, it's the Crusader playing chess with death, and it's become like iconic. There was even a silly like Bill and Ted movie that riffed on it, but it the ability to welcome death and welcome it as like a return home and liberation from the desperate, fervent demands of will, that I can understand why he looked at that as a remedy for the long crisis of European civilization. But I'm no expert either.
Yeah, I think I generally get a disagreement with it when I read it, and that might be like my sentimentality for worldly things or whatever. But I do find that these sorts of ways of thinking, although they are, I guess, to borrow some language, they do kind of lead to this kind of zen and contentment with the world as it is, as opposed to how we'd like to find it. They do sort of these views of the world. They do sort of lack telos. I mean, so you maybe use some Spenglerian language. It sort of lacks that Faustian spirit of striving. And I think what it's really lacking is that route to human meaning, which I think is found through the Faustian spirit for European man anyway. And perhaps this is what Nietzsche was getting at in his opposition to Schopenhauer. But for this reason, this is why I think that, to return to what we were talking about before, the idea of utopia just falls afoul of the inevitability of suffering. Because, I mean, this is to quote Schopenhauer from his essay on the suffering of the world. This is him on utopia. In utopia, some men would die of boredom or hang themselves. Some would fight and kill one another. And thus they would create for themselves more suffering than nature inflicts on them as it is.
Yeah. No, that's both poignant and very telling. Yeah, 100%.
Cool. I think that's a good one in that point. One thing I did want to talk about before we wrap up is you've mentioned a couple of times in various discussions the idea of genetic memory. I think it's a really interesting topic. I'd like to get what you how you conceive of that and what you think the implications are. But just to relate it to Schopenhauer, it definitely this notion comes out in the ways he is metaphysical. When he talks about the sexual impulse specifically as a way to exist beyond one's existence. To quote him again from the World of Will and Representation. The satisfaction of the sexual impulse goes beyond the affirmation of one's existence that fills so short a time. It affirms life for an indefinite time beyond the death of the individual.
Yeah, that's I mean, honestly, like I'd like to do a dedicated episode on epigenetic memory and things. I mean, for a lot of reasons. I mean, not just because I think it's an important topic, but it bears on what I'm writing about right now in my long form. But it's the whole, as it's become clear too, and epigenetic memory is a real thing. Okay, that's been demonstrated with sound methodology these days, and the degree to which memory is heritable. I mean, there's a lot here. Okay, we're not just talking about bits and pieces, you know, of discrete, actual, like immersive memory, being passed on to future generations. Although that's certainly not impossible. But we're talking about a kind of total conceptual orientation towards everything from from religious symbols, to a preference for a certain kind of aesthetic schema, to a tendency to respond towards certain ways of speaking, you know, aesthetically and dialectically, over time, presumably, and as this insularity is increasingly, is increasingly kind of ossifies within discrete bloodlines, who are related in basic capacities, due to traits held in common that are collectively rare in every other population. You're talking about a truly kind of like timeless historical memory that is quite literally transmitted across generational lines, which means that it endures beyond death. Okay. And the more these things could be accessed in a conscious and deliberate capacity, obviously the more like insight could be would be developed around this. But just the very fact of this process means that talking about somebody's culture of origin, if you're talking about somebody being a Bavarian, or a denizen of the Black Forest, with millennia of heritage in that same loci, or if you're talking about like a Comanche Indian, okay, to remove that person from the ability to access that conceptual schema that he carries quite literally within his DNA. You're not you're committing an act of mass murder, basically, because I mean you're killing off all who came before and all who contributed to that discrete conceptual foundation, which is the basis for really all behaviors of that people in any communitarian or cultural capacity. Okay. That's why I made the point that, this idea of, which was, an absolute priority of the Americans and the Bolsheviks, and, remains an absolute raison d'etre of the American regime. This idea of like eradicating identitarian phenomena of historical nature that really is a monstrous thing. But it's also you're creating people who are only built for lives of despair, as well as people who are really incapable of revolting against extant authority. I mean, not just because, you know, they're beaten down or whatever. Like, they may not even be like physically beaten down in the way we're thinking of, you know, metaphorically speaking, but they've just got nothing to draw upon that constitutes an alternative in their mind. And they can't even identify the source of their despair, because what their you know, what their lineage was, has they've been completely alienated from, and owing to various modalities of intervention, you know, be them merely sociological and and geologic, or you know, be they pharmaceutical or pharmacological, or you know, involving unnecessary surgery or anything else. You know, you're eradicating that person's ability to live historically, which means he's a prisoner in his own life, and his existence is probably comparable to that of a death row inmate. You know, he's simply waiting to die, and seeking out, you know, banal stimulus in order to distract himself from the fact of his death. But you know, through total alienation with his origins, through total alienation, you know, with the culture and the peoples who literally created him. You know, you're also, it's through coming to know ourselves that we come to know our people, and we come to love our fellow man, and it's through those processes that we come to know God. So, you know, it's, I cannot overstate the degree to which this is a grave crime against the person, as well as against world human heritage, if you want to look at it like that.
Yeah. And it seems like with that, we've really cut through the bullshit of like liberal versus conservative, any culture war stuff. And what's really emerging there is a particularist ethic that can really oppose the, you know, the metaphysics of universalism is the only way I can put it, that seem to pervade. I think that's a really good place to end. I do have a tongue-in-cheek viewer question.
Yeah.
So, Thomas, are you an alpha, a beta, or a sigma male? And what do you think of that way of viewing the world?
I mean, I think that stuff's silly. Like, you know, like I know that, I mean, I'm old, so like I remember people used to bandy that shit, like when these corny like pickup artist guys were around. Like, I don't. I mean, I mean, I guess like a sigma is kind of like an outlaw type dude who like does what he wants. I mean, I don't know, man. Like, a lot of that stuff strikes me as like affectations. Like, oh, if you're like an alpha male, you do this. Like, I don't. There's the way I mean, the way I try and carry myself, man. Like, it's my own kind of I guess it's my own. Maybe this is corny to people, but like it's my own kind of interpretation of like Kant's categorical imperative, or like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. You know, like, I got to imagine like everything I do, like, you know, prosaic or profound. Like, can I tolerate that being like repeated endlessly over and over again? Like, if I couldn't, like, I adjust myself accordingly. You know, I you know, so I can't, like I said, I mean, I don't know, man. Like, I don't put a lot of stock in that kind of stuff. I You know, I'm a guy who lives by a code, man, and like I'm a sinner like every other man, so like I fail a lot, but um I I'm very, very aware. I go out of my way to never, ever, ever embarrass myself or my people writ large, and especially not my comrades and people who I love. And that's and I never tolerate slights to honor without, you know, um without standing up for myself, and, you know, demanding satisfaction for such things. I mean, and I'm certainly not like a tough guy or anything at all, but, you know, that's what such things call for. That's the best answer I can give.
Yeah, I'm definitely on board with you. Yeah, I think those sorts of frameworks of viewing the world are often a deep cope for a deep spiritual sickness is the way I'll put it.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's better than I phrase it. Yeah, I think I agree.
Yeah, I'm basically trying to make fun of the guy who actually did send me that question, but yeah.
No, I'm glad people can answer what they want, man. I mean, I'm stoked that they're like engaged with your. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. You've got great content, but I no, anything people want to ask is fine as long as it's not something totally gross or corny or something. No, it's fine, man. I'm glad people are dropping questions on us.
Cool. Yeah. So, anything else? Anything you want to plug? I know Mind Phaser season 2 is coming up.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that. There's a lot of really good things in the pipeline. I'll drop in the next couple of days a statement on my Substack. I know I've been meaning to do that, but again, I just got back from New York, and then things were kind of hectic with me being sick. But yeah, there's a lot of good things are underway, man. You can find me for the time being on Twitter. It's at number 7 HOMAS 777 underscore official. You can find me on Substack, realthomas777.substack.com. I'm on Instagram, like Seek and You Shall Find. I've been doing a lot of stuff with Pete Canones, who's a dear friend of mine and of ours. So seek out his stuff. And yeah, I'd love to continue our conversation, man. Just don't feel pressured, but let me know. I'll be gone from the 11th to the 13th of August. And about a month later, I'm going out of town again. But other than that, I'm going to be home in Chicago, man. So just let me know whenever it's convenient to record again, and we'll get it done.
Great, cool. Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah.